Thank you very much, Margarita. So I'll try to address a number of questions in my webinar today. First, what is emergence? Second, what are the different types or degrees of emergence? Third, how is social emergence different from physical and biological emergence? Fourth, what are the main arguments for and against emergence? And fifth, and finally, how do the answers to these questions affect how we do social science? So first, what is emergence? Emergence is the idea that a whole is, or at least can be, greater than the sum of its parts. A piece of glass is more than just a heap of sand. A strand of DNA is more than just a random series of proteins. A collection of books is more than a pile of paper, and so on. So sociology tacitly assumes the possibility of emergence. It assumes that there are social structures of various kinds that are somehow more than just a collection of individuals. And the other social sciences also make tacit assumptions about emergent structures. Economists talk about markets, political scientists talk about states, anthropologists talk about cultures, and so on. Now, there are, of course, some social scientists, including some sociologists who explicitly reject the possibility of emergence. Here I'm thinking of so-called methodological individualists who argue that a good explanation must always supply micro-foundations. That is, they assume that any macro terms like group or institution or symbol, have to be translated into micro terms. Individualistic assumptions like this are also very widespread within popular culture, especially in the United States, and in the Anglophone democracies more generally. The late Maggie Thatcher once quipped that there is no such thing as society, just individuals. And if you've ever taught an introductory sociology course to American undergraduates, I'm sure you will have encountered these prejudices yourself already. So that's one reason why you should care about what emergence is. Because if there is no such thing as emergence, then there's really no point doing sociology. And if you can't explain what emergence is, then you'll have a hard time defending sociology from its critics. Okay, on to the second question. What are the various types or degrees of emergence? So I defined emergence as the idea that a whole is or can be greater than the sum of its parts, but greater in what sense? Here I think it will be helpful if we distinguish a couple of different types of emergence. I'm going to call them epistemological emergence, chaotic emergence, and ontological emergence. I feel pretty confident about the difference between epistemological and ontological emergence, a little less confident about the coherence of chaotic emergence, but let me try it out. So epistemological emergence involves the emergence of qualitative patterns. Bird flocking is a very good example. I'm guessing some of you have probably witnessed bird flocking firsthand at some point. You're standing near a marsh or pond in the early morning. There are birds everywhere in the water and on the land. Suddenly a few of them take wing. Others quickly follow, and soon enough the air is full of flapping wings. The birds cluster together and spiral upwards. Within a matter of minutes, they've coalesced into a V shape and begin flying southwards. These patterns may look to us like they're the result of some kind of collective plan or group leadership, but they probably aren't. Rather, they're mostly the results of individuals interacting according to a couple of simple rules: how close to stay to the other birds near you, how sharply to turn, and so on and so forth. And this is why, as you can see on the screen, it's relatively simple to simulate bird flocking and achieve different patterns just by playing around with these basic rules and parameters. So pattern emergence of this sort is not at all unique to the animal world. We can easily think of examples in the social world too. Here you might consider Thomas Schelling's famous model of residential segregation. It works pretty much the same way. If you assume a population composed of two races, says Schelling, and then you further assume that each individual has some preference about the racial composition of their neighborhood, then you'll pretty quickly generate familiar patterns of racial segregation. In fact, under most assumptions, the level of segregation that results will actually be much higher than most agents would actually prefer. So you can't explain the pattern as the result of the aggregation of individual preferences, since it actually runs contrary to what most people want. Philosophers call this epistemological emergence because it has to do with the human ability to discern patterns. So chaotic emergence, as I'm defining it, involves the emergence of order within some parameters. In cases like this, we have good reason to believe that some kind of pattern or structure is going to emerge out of a sequence of interactions. And we also know something about the range of patterns or structures that's likely to emerge, but we can't predict the precise outcome with any degree of exactitude. So meteorology obviously provides some pretty good examples of this. We might know that a tropical storm is going to emerge in a particular area. We might be able to forecast that its strength and trajectory are going to fall within some particular range, but we won't be able to predict them with any great exactitude. One could perhaps also argue that political sociology deals with cases of chaotic emergence. It can maybe make a few broadcasts about the likelihood of protest movements or other forms of contentious politics, but not with any great precision as to timing and form. So think of Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party. It seemed very likely that the financial crisis of 2008 and the financial bailouts that followed would generate serious unrest, but no one claimed to have predicted the exact time and form this unrest would take. And once those movements emerged, they had very significant effects on American politics. They were, in other words, more durable and more impactful than a flock of birds. Philosophers don't have a special term for this kind of emergence, but since this is something that theorists of chaos, complexity, and self-organization deal with all the time, I'm going to call it chaotic emergence. So this brings us finally to the third type, what I'm going to call ontological emergence. Ontological emergence involves the emergence of stable structures with new causal powers. By new causal powers, I mean powers that are not possessed by the constituent elements of the emergent entity in question. So the classic example, the textbook example, is the water molecule. Water has certain causal powers not possessed by hydrogen or oxygen in isolation. For example, the power to extinguish certain kinds of fires, right? Hydrogen and oxygen obviously do not have this power. Add oxygen to a fire and it will grow. Add hydrogen to a fire and it will explode. So water has causal powers that its constituent entities do not. This is what I mean by emergent or new causal powers. Now let me give you a more sociological example, a factory. It consists of various elements, workers and managers, buildings and equipment, raw and finished materials, all arranged into a certain spatio-temporal form so as to facilitate a certain kind of workflow or work process. Let's just say it's a pin factory, like the famous pin factory in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Taken separately, none of the constituent elements of the pin factory have the capacity to make pins. They only possess that power when organized in a certain way. So we can also think about these three types of emergence as three different degrees of emergence. So epistemological emergence involves the emergence of a qualitative pattern, but not of a durable structure. Chaotic emergence involves the emergence of a relatively durable structure, but not of new causal powers. And ontological emergence involves the emergence of a durable structure with new causal powers not possessed by its constituent elements. I think we can helpfully imagine a continuum of emergence running from what I'm going to call pure aggregation on one end to ontological emergence on the other. So by a pure aggregate, I mean something like a heap of sand. Whatever pattern it forms results primarily from external and contingent forces, wind, waves, whatever. It doesn't have any internal or necessary structure. One could substitute one grain of sand for another or move the sand around, and there would be no meaningful change in its structure or powers. The sociological analogy might be something like a crowd at a sporting event. Now then, at the other end of the spectrum, we have ontological emergence. That is a structure that has internal and necessary organization that generates causal powers, like the water molecule or the pin factory. A bird flock or a segregated city would be somewhere in between. It can become a durable structure, and this structure might enhance the causal powers of the constituent entities. It might enable birds to fly faster or further, for example, or it might enable whites to oppress blacks more effectively. But it does not generate any new causal powers which the birds or the white people did not already possess in that context. The water molecule and the pin factory not only have a durable structure, they also possess new causal powers by virtue of the internal relations between their constituent parts. All right, let me take up the third question now, which concerns the relationship between physical, biological, and social emergence, how they're similar and how they're different. So far, I've really been talking about emergence as if it meant the same thing in the physical, biological, and social sciences, and that is most definitely not the case. While physical and biological examples can sometimes provide helpful analogies when we're thinking about social emergence, it's very important to keep the disanalogies in mind as well. And here is a very sort of brief overview of how I think about these differences. So I would argue that physical emergence depends on spatial relations between physical parts. So a water molecule is a water molecule because it consists of certain powers that stand in a certain spatial relationship to one another. Hydrogen and oxygen atoms are held together by physical bonds. If those bonds are broken by electrolysis, say, water ceases to be water, it becomes oxygen and hydrogen. Biological emergence, by contrast, depends on spatial and temporal relations between physical and functional parts. Why temporal? Let me give you an example, a morbid one. What is the difference between a living organism and a fresh corpse? Nothing in the spatial relations between the various parts has changed. What has changed is the temporal relations between them. Blood is no longer circulating, neurons are no longer firing, and so on. So the crucial point here is that biological structures differ from physical structures insofar as they are what they are by virtue of characteristic forms of activity. And this activity can only be defined in functional terms, that is, in relationship to the entire organism. If that activity is durably interrupted, these entities cease to be what they are. Okay, now on to social emergence. Social emergence depends on spatial, temporal, and intentional relations between physical, functional, and symbolic parts. I want to emphasize that I'm using the word intentional here in the philosophical sense, which is a lot looser and a little bit more technical than the everyday sense. It doesn't mean that one has a conscious goal or a shared plan. It simply means that there is some sort of focus of shared attention. Okay, and social emergence differs from biological emergence also, and obviously in the sense that it incorporates symbols and various other kinds of intersubjective meaning, usually through language. All right, so I've now laid the groundwork to give you a kind of a simple, generic definition of social structures. Social structures are at once physical, biological, and cultural. More specifically, they consist of human artifacts, human persons, and human symbols, all of which stand in a certain spatial, temporal, and attentional relationship to one another, such that they are temporally durable and causally generative. I think it should be clear by now what I mean by persons and symbols, but let me be clear about what I mean by artifacts. By artifacts, I don't necessarily mean archaeological artifacts. I mean the term somewhat more broadly to include any physical objects intentionally made by human beings. That could be the clothes you're wearing, the monitor you're looking at, the headphones you're listening to, the chair you're sitting on, the building you're living in, and so on and so on. Collective intentionality of the sort that one finds in human societies often involves symbolic systems. Language is the most obvious one, but not the only one. Social structures, like biological ones, are sustained and reproduced through activity, human activity in this case, of course. If the activity ceases, the structure dies, quote unquote. Those social structures do have a Lazarus-like potential to be resurrected. A dead structure can be revived, a shuttered factory can be reopened, A closed school can be reopened. A moribund club can be relaunched, and so on and so forth. So thus far, my definition of social structure is, I think, pretty standard. Where it departs a little bit from the typical understanding is in its attention to artifacts. I think that's actually an obvious point. A sociology department, for instance, is not just persons and symbols. It's also offices and desks and computers and so on. A factory is not just labor and capital, it's also plant and equipment, so on and so on. I'm not sure why the material dimension of social structure is so often downplayed by social scientists, but I'm sure that this results in the conception of social structure. All right, let me turn now to the fourth question, which concerns arguments for and against emergence. But before I do that, I'm just going to, again, briefly recap the argument that I've made up to this point. So first, I've argued that there are various degrees of emergence that can be arrayed on a spectrum. Pure aggregativity is at one end, ontological emergence is at the other, epistemological and chaotic emergence are in between. I've also argued that epistemological emergence involves internally generated patterns, that chaotic emergence creates new internal structures, and that ontological emergence generates new causal powers. I further argued that physical, biological, and social emergence build on and surpass one another. Physical emergence involves spatial relations between physical parts. Biological emergence involves spatial and temporal relations between physical and functional parts. And social emergence involves spatial, temporal, and intentional relations between physical, functional, and symbolic parts. So this definition of social emergence leads to a definition of social structure as durable configurations of human artifacts, human persons, and human symbols that generate new causal powers. All right, so enter the critic. The critic says, I can see people, and I can see them interacting with each other. I can see them singing and arguing, for example. I can see them marching, voting, or buying and selling stuff, and so on and so on. But I can't see social fields, or local cultures, or nation states, or free markets, or any of the other kinds of social structures that social scientists like to talk about. To me, those are just theoretical abstractions. They might be useful as heuristic devices or as analytic devices or whatever, but they don't seem to me like they're real in any meaningful sense. For example, they don't seem to be independent of human minds, at least not in the way that a molecule is. All right, so that's the critic. Let's unpack the critic's objections in a little bit more detail and see how well they hold up. So first, there's a skeptical argument here, which is the argument that seeing is believing. I can't see a social structure. The skeptic says, I don't believe the social structures exist. Now, the problem with the skeptical argument is that it undermines most scientific theories, not just social scientific ones, but also theories in the physical and biological sciences. We can't see electrons or DNA after all, at least not with the unaided senses. Aha, responds the skeptic, but we can see them with special scientific instruments, right? That's true. We can see electrons and other subatomic particles in the bubble chamber of a nuclear accelerator, or we can see DNA with an electron microscope. True, says the anti-skeptic, but can't we also see social structures with the instruments of social science, with class analysis or network theory or survey instruments? So much for the skeptic. Next up, the reductionist. The reductionist argument is that everything in the world is made up of some kind of basic stuff, and that everything that happens in the world can ultimately be explained in terms of the behavior of that basic kind of stuff. And if we just figure out how that stuff works, then we'll soon enough have a theory of everything. In social science, the reductionist argument generally takes the form of methodological individualism. The methodological individualist, it should be noted, is not a skeptic. She believes in non-observable entities like preferences or values or codes or whatever. Some methodological individualists are even prepared to allow for a certain degree of emergence. For example, analytical sociologists assume a macro level of epistemological emergence. What they deny is the possibility of ontological emergence. But here's the problem. Why should reduction stop with the individual? Why not just keep on going? From the individual to the brain, from the brain to genes, from genes to proteins, and so on and so on. To which the reductionists might respond that yes, one day everything will indeed be reducible to physics. Now this might seem far-fetched to you, but this is actually quite a common view within the philosophy of science. This brings me then to the third argument against emergence, which I'll call the epistemological argument. The epistemological critic says, well, just because we don't have a reductionistic account for something right now doesn't mean that we won't develop one in the future. What makes you so sure that anthropology and sociology won't eventually be reduced to physics? She might then go on to point to various examples of puzzling phenomena that eventually yielded to reductionistic accounts in the history of science. Let me give you an example of successful reduction from the social sciences this time. For most of a century, Marxist sociologists were perplexed by the failure of the working class to revolt against its exploitation. Then, in the 1980s, Jerry Cohen and Adam Przeworski showed that this was due to the free rider problem. While it might be collectively rational for workers to revolt against capitalism, it's not individually rational for any one worker to do so, they argued. The risks usually outweigh the benefits. The problem with the epistemological argument, though, is that reductionist campaigns don't always succeed. In fact, the history of science is littered with failed efforts at reduction. I'll just give you one particularly recent example. Recent efforts at genetic reductionism, the effort to find the gene for X, breast cancer, alcoholism, intelligence, or whatever. Today it's widely regarded as a failure. Most biologists now believe that most individual level traits are actually the result of complex interactions between genes, bodies, and the social and natural environment. Social epigenetics is the new mantra. Just because reductionist campaigns sometimes succeed does not imply that they always succeed. This brings me to the fourth and final argument against emergence, the hermeneutic argument. This is the most common argument against social emergence that one encounters among social scientists, and it's probably also the most powerful one. So I'm going to unpack it in a little bit of detail. The hermeneutic argument against social emergence consists of four counter-arguments, which I'm going to call ontological, methodological, epistemological, and constructivist. They're all powerful at first glance, but I think they're also all vulnerable to powerful counter-arguments. So let's look at them one at a time. The ontological argument is the natural and social worlds are fundamentally different. The natural world, it's argued, is a law-governed world of empirical regularities, but the social world is a meaning-governed world of human autonomy. The ontological argument leads on to the methodological argument. Because the natural and social worlds are fundamentally different, it's argued, they must also be studied with fundamentally different methods. The natural world, for example, can be studied by means of controlled experiments, but the social world must be studied by means of human interpretation. The methodological argument then leads to the epistemological one. Whatever knowledge we have of the social world, it's argued, is ultimately perspectival. It's our interpretations of other people's interpretations. We can never really have anything like an objective understanding. Thus, and this is the fourth argument, all social structures are just social constructs of the social scientists. They are not something which exists independently of human minds. All right, so let me present some counter-arguments step by step. The problem with these arguments is that they're all a bit overstated. The ontological argument rests on an exaggerated contrast between natural and social science. Take the biological sciences, for example. They don't describe a law-governed world of empirical regularities. Rather, they seek to discover causal mechanisms in much the way that the social sciences do. The gap between the social and natural sciences is particularly small in fields like evolutionary biology or systems ecology, which examine complex systems in a historical context. In fact, it's not even clear anymore that the that physics describes a law-governed world of empirical regularities, as was once claimed. In fact, law-like regularities really only appear in two contexts, controlled experiments in the lab and analyses of simple systems. Astronomy and cosmology, for example, are every bit as messy as evolutionary biology and systems ecology. The second problem with the hermeneutic argument is that it rests on an overly romanticized account of human agency. A lot of human action is habitual and non-reflective. Moreover, agents' understandings of their own actions are sometimes ill-informed and even systematically distorted. To be sure, interpretation must always be a part of social science. About that, the hermeneuticists are right and the positivists are wrong. But interpretation can never be the whole of social science. There, the positivists really do have a point. Social science is and must be, I would argue, a methodologically pluralist enterprise, one that includes objectifying as well as subjectifying methods. So here we see the problem with the epistemological argument. While it's true that knowledge of the social world always begins from a particular perspective, it need not end there. In everyday interaction, we're often called on to take the perspective of the other, and in social science, we sometimes try to systematically catalog the perspectives of all others. We do so not merely because we wish to understand the perspective of the other, we also do so in order to understand the principles of vision and division that structure the social space that we're investigating. By this means, we can achieve a perspective that is objectifying, if not necessarily objective in some final or God's eye sense. But doesn't this vindicate the fourth and final point of the hermeneuticist argument? The argument that the social world is not mind-independent in the same way that the physical world is? Yes and no. It's certainly true that social structures are not altogether independent of human minds taken in the aggregate. However, they are independent of any particular human mind. We can, after all, be quite mistaken about how a particular social structure works or how it's put together. We have that experience often enough in daily life when we violate a rule or fail to follow proper procedure. Moreover, social structures are not altogether dependent on human minds either. Remember, social structures also include human artifacts which can be studied in their own right, even if the human beings who made them are long dead. In fact, there's an entire discipline devoted to such studies. It's called archaeology. This discipline presumes that we can study social structures because they have a reality that is independent of human minds. So let me amplify this point just a little bit. I think that greater attention to the artifactual dimension of social structures can significantly deepen our understanding of social structure and provide us with some additional means of studying it. Let me just very quickly sketch a few examples. I would venture to say that most social scientists define social structure, tacitly at least, in terms of human persons and their symbolic interactions. I call this the interactionist ontology. Defining social structure in terms of an interactionist ontology, however, leads to at least two errors. First, it leads us to believe that social structures are far more evanescent and mutable than they actually are. Second, it leads us to imagine that interpersonal relations and intersubjective forms are the sole source of structural cohesion. In truth, material artifacts are also a powerful means of stabilizing and delimiting a social structure, maybe even the most powerful one in some cases. And greater attention to material artifacts provides another methodological instrument for studying social structure. We could, for example, attend to the distribution and circulation of particular types of artifacts. This would provide another means of discovering the internal structures and external boundaries of a social structure. Further, greater attention to material artifacts also provides a powerful means for studying the emergence, reproduction, and transformation of social structures. Consider the invention of various material technologies for durably storing written information, such as clay tablets, papyrus, parchment, paper, and so on. They were all crucial to the formation of large-scale political structures, states, generically speaking, because they made it possible to track taxes and tributes. In fact, so far as we know, this was the principal motivation behind the invention of most early writing systems, that is, record keeping. Needless to say, the invention of writing had innumerable unintended consequences. The externalization and objectification of concepts and language was crucial to the development of theoretical consciousness, to the formation of new social groups, the intellectuals, so on. In other words, it was a crucial condition of possibility of us, and it remains so. Finally, material artifacts are crucial to the reproduction of social structures. Consider the role, for instance, that domestic architecture and home decoration play in the production, reproduction of certain understandings of, say, family, sexuality, privacy, and so on. This was, in fact, a well-developed theme in the social histories of the Annales school, and also a somewhat underdeveloped theme in Bourdieu's writings as well. Many key principles of vision, division, he argues, are embedded in and inculcated through the physical layout and aesthetic principles of the family home. This is something which is well understood in neighboring fields like architecture and anthropology, but does not usually receive the systematic attention it deserves within sociology. All right, so let me now briefly turn to some of the sort of what I see as some of the broader implications of social emergence for doing social science. I think the first really important implication is that methodological pluralism is not accidental, it's essential to the practice of good social science. It is, there are no gold standards in social science methods. There's no one particular methodological procedure of which all other methods are just vague and imperfect approximations, whether that's experiments or regression analysis or something else. And the reason for this is that social science involves analysis of multiple emergent levels of reality, each of which is constituted of multiple different elements. And we need to have methods that are appropriate to our objects rather than searching for objects that are appropriate to our methods. The second major implication of this, I think, is about our understanding of social theory. So social theories do lots of things. But one of the things which a good social theory does is it develops a useful social ontology. And by this, I mean some account of the kind of basic furniture of the social world, the things of which a given social world is composed. And in fact, I think you could argue that many of the greatest advances in social science did not have to do with making better predictions or with discovering more robust regularities. They actually had to do with discovering structures and describing structures that had not been fully or adequately understood before. And here I would just point most recently to Bourdieu's theory of social fields, which has been extraordinarily important across a whole range of subdisciplines and subfields within sociology. So the third implication that I'd like to call out here is to do with our understanding of what sociological explanation consists of. So we have long been taught that sociological explanation involves describing regularities or sequences of events or relationship, temporal sequences of necessitation in the social world. And certainly that is one thing which a good explanation will try to do. But there is, I think, another kind of causation or causal relationship in the world, which is I'm going to call formal causation. or structural causation. And this is, formal or structural causes are not ones that play out across time. They're ones that play out across different levels of social reality, in the sense that higher order structures constrain and enable lower order entities. So this is something which we're quite familiar with in talking about the way in which social structures influence individuals, but we have a difficult time describing this because we always try to describe it in terms of kind of billiard balls or atoms colliding into each other across time. The fourth and final plug that I'm going to make here comes from the theory of social structure that I've developed, and that is the importance of recovering the material dimension of social structure. I think without adequate attention to the artifactual dimension of social structure, we not only deprive ourselves of a good sort of methodological vantage point for studying society, but we also imagine that social structures are much more flimsy and evanescent than they really are. So that's it for now, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Phil. We now have about, we have until 1:30 for questions, and I've already been receiving some questions, and I would encourage all of you to go ahead and submit more questions. The types of questions that we've been getting that I would encourage you to ask would be questions of clarification. Can you go back to a certain point and explain again what you meant by the different kinds of emergence? Another type of question we've been getting that we'd be happy to talk about is, well, how does this apply to a specific field in sociology or a specific question? What are some extensions or some applications of this? So to get us started, I will start with a question that's more a question of clarification, Phil. One person is asking whether the difference between epistemological and chaotic emergence is primarily about predictability. That is, can you predict the pattern of residential creation more easily than you can predict a form or outcomes of a protest movement?
Sorry about that. I started answering the question, but I had forgotten to unmute my phone. So as I said, I'm a little uncertain about whether chaotic emergence really is fundamentally different, or if I've captured the difference conceptually in the way that I would like to. You're right that talking about it in terms of unpredictability is not really quite the same as the way that I set it up at the beginning in terms of the emergence of some kind of durable structure, right? So maybe the really sort of key difference between epistemological and chaotic emergence isn't just unpredictability, but is the emergence of something which is more of a durable structure, right? So that, like a example of epistemological emergence might be, something like a traffic jam, or right, or a bird flock, something which sort of emerges in a kind of evanescent way, but doesn't really have any kind of stability, whereas this sort of middle kind of emergence that I'm thinking about might have a kind of a more durable structure, but wouldn't really have any causal power. So like so like residential segregation would fit that example pretty well. But I'll have to, as I said, I'm a little uncertain about inserting this middle term. This isn't the standard way in which philosophers who argue about emergence usually talk. I mean, they usually make this distinction between epistemological and ontological emergence. I'm just wondering whether there's not another sort of intermediate type between them. So that's a good question, and one that I'll give some more thought. Thank you for that.
Okay, Phil, there's another question about the different types of emergence. So the question says, in regard to the difference between physical and biological emergence, is the prior really restricted to spatial relations? What about energy, e.g. the fresh quark and phase states?
Right. That's a good point too. As I was going over the talk again, I felt a little bit uncomfortable at the way that I had phrased it in terms of activity, as distinctive of the biological. I think that it is somewhat problematic to think about the physical as being passive, as matter as being inert. That's actually not quite right. And so maybe the real difference is not just sort of activity versus passivity, but that it's certain kinds of activity. Activity that, for example, might be about reproducing an extant structure. So there's this sort of famous Aristotelian concept of entelechy, which I'm told by people who actually know ancient Greek that the sort of literal translation would be being at work, staying the same. Something like that I'm maybe getting at. But yeah, I think you're quite right about this. I'm also a little uncomfortable with just sort of activity versus passivity, but I'm very open to ideas about how one could characterize this difference between the physical and the biological. I feel a little more comfortable with this idea that one of the differences is functional relations between parts. In other words, you can really only understand what's a part and what's a whole in functional terms, or the interrelationship between parts in functional terms. So you can't really, this is sort of a famous example that goes back to Pascal. You can't sort of dissect the human body, in the way that you can split a molecule up or split an atom up, right? It's not sort of clear what the constituent parts are, where one part ends and another part begins, right? With all of the kind of the tissue, you can really only talk about the distinctions between various parts of organism's body, I think, in terms of function. And I think there must be something that one can say distinctive about the kind of activity that living organisms are engaged in, different from the kind of that sort of energy that one finds in physical structures. But that's something I'm going to have to give a little bit more thought to. Thanks also for that.
Okay, great. We have a lot of questions in the queue, but I would certainly encourage you to keep submitting them because, as I said, even if we don't get to all of them during our live talk, we will try to answer them later. So I wanted to move on to a couple of questions that people are asking about some of the applications or some of the examples that you talked about, Phil, and how that might clarify this concept of emergence. So one listener asks, well, if the difference between emergence and aggregation, if the difference between emergence and aggregation revolves around the appearance of new causal powers, then how can the pin factory be an example of emergence? Individual human beings can produce pins. Factories can produce pins more efficiently. So this is not a new emergent causal power. Rather, and in contrast to the example of water, it's the same causal power increased by means of organization.
Okay, that's another great question. So I think it's true that if you are comparing an artisanal pin maker to a pin factory, to an artisanal pin maker to a pin factory, then it's true that the difference is simply one of efficiency. But it's not the case that if you look at the pin factory in synchronic terms, that the people who work in a pin factory could individually make pins. So this tells you that one of the things which has to happen or does happen when you start having pin factories is some kind of a process of de-skilling or loss of artisanal knowledge. But if you look at the pin factory in synchronic terms, it's probably is not the case that individual workers could all make the pins by themselves. And certainly if you're thinking about more complex things, which will soon enough be made in factories, there's no individual who could make these things in a kind of an artisanal fashion. I mean, if you're talking about whatever, a computer today or even a steam engine 250 years ago, there would have been probably no single artisan who really would have been capable of all of the different, all different processes, who would have possessed all the different skills that would have been necessary. And certainly nobody, even an artisanal pin maker or an artisanal metal worker, would have been able to make all of these things without physical tools, a physical space. You could think then about the factory replacing a workshop as one kind of, it's different kinds of social structure as opposed to simply replacing a worker. But I think this distinction that you're making, this is a tricky one, right, between increased causal powers and new causal powers. Sometimes new social structures probably do replace old ones simply because they're more efficient at doing something that could already be done by previous social structures. So that might suggest even another way of thinking about structural change. I mean, the familiar one, of course. We oftentimes think about institutional change in terms of these kind of evolutionary selections based on some kind of efficiency or other.
Okay, in this vein of questions that are about application or extension, someone would like to know whether you could discuss more how you could apply this understanding of social structure to how we understand social stratification, especially as it relates to race. So how does thinking about different levels of social reality impact the way that we think about stratification and racism?
That's a great question. I think one thing that's very important, but is already being studied by a lot of people, is the importance of social space and social stratification. So instead of thinking about stratification simply as in terms of distribution of resources or the distribution of educational credentials, that is things that are possessed by particular individuals, to think about it as something which also has to be conceived in spatial terms. I think the next sort of step here would also be to recognize the way in which this is not sort of movement around in a kind of a frictionless social space, nor is this a sort of a social space that's easily reconfigured. Stratification, and in particular sort of racial stratification, the way that it works in the United States anyway, has everything to do with the creation of a particular kind of built environment or particular segregation of various different built environments. I mean, this is why you can't really understand how racism works in the United States without understanding ghettos, right? I mean, that's really what ghetto is. Or one way of thinking about what it is it's a place where where you have really all three of these different elements of social structure coalescing. You have this artifactual dimension, particular kind of built environment. You have that environment sort of culturally coded in a particular way, and of course, you have people divided up across these different environments, according to sort of racial ascriptions to particular human persons. So, I don't know that thinking about social structure in this way is necessarily going to tell scholars of race something that they don't already know, at least tacitly. I think that what it might do is it might just sort of help in some sense at a sort of a meta or reflective level to kind of think about, okay, what are the different things that have to go into a coherent account of racial segregation? What might be the things that we've left out or that I've left out of my account? What are the things that I might need to attend to a little bit more closely, or that would require closer investigation, right? So, I think that's often the role that kind of meta-theoretical considerations or ontological considerations are going to play in actual everyday social research. They're just another kind of check, on our research. As we're sort of thinking about, how well have I done this? What else do I need to do? This just provides, maybe sort of an additional kind of checklist of things that a good account definitely should do.
Okay, there's one further question about an application that you talked about during your talk. You mentioned the Occupy Wall Street movement. And so one of our listeners wants to know, does Emergence give us some new insight into various aspects of, for example, social movement theory? So does Emergence help us understand various categories of resource mobilization, for example?
That is another very good question. How does Emergence help us to think about social movements? I guess my response might be similar to the one that I just gave about racial segregation, right? It kind of tells you different sorts of things that you might want to look for. I think where it might be more helpful in this case, though, is that the kind of theory of social structure that I laid out also gives you a foundation for thinking about what we might call structurality and structuration. What I mean by structurality and structuration is the degree to which something is a durable structure, and why it is, or why it does or doesn't become a durable structure. So let me sort of again use this example of artifactuality. So quite essential, I would think, to the Occupy Wall Street movement was this occupation of Wall Street, right? This particular physical location. These, if you ever strolled around there, right, a lot of sort of actual, physical structures were thrown up, sort of book stands and little stages and tents and whatnot, and so on and so forth. But that also made the movement in a certain way really quite vulnerable, right? I mean, as soon as that space was cleared and those structures were swept away, there really wasn't, so far as I know, I'm no expert, anything really to replace it. And, contrast this with, for example, a kind of social movement that actually manages to establish some kind of a physical headquarters, or maybe a whole network of physical headquarters, like union locals for the union movement, right? I mean, this creates a certain kind of stability or permanence to a social structure. And I think this is, if you think really sort of in the, in the sort of broader and longer term, that this is something that you find is really true of many social structures. That the ones that last the longest are also the ones that establish some relatively durable set of physical structures. If you think about a religious movement or a religious community, this is having sort of temple or cult or church centers or whatever is one of the things that creates a certain degree of permanence. So if there's any sort of insight to be gained, I guess, from this, it would probably be that in a sense you might almost say that Occupy Wall Street succumbed to the interactionist fallacy, which was to imagine that a social movement really is just a bunch of people and the interactions between them and not much more than that.
Okay, Phil, we have a few further questions of clarification of your argument that have come in. One is actually coming from our next webinar presenter, George Steinmetz, who, as I mentioned earlier to everyone, will be giving a webinar on December 9th on a critical realist view of comparative and historical sociology. But George's question is, well, aren't all artifacts mind-dependent, at least with respect to the mind of the archaeologist, the historian, etc.?
I guess it depends on what you mean by mind dependent, right? So I think this idea of mind dependency or mind independency is a litmus test or a criteria that many people use when they're making an argument for the reality of something. So a kind of a realist, sort of the sort of hallmark of a philosophical realist of some kind or another is always going to be, well, the world is mind independent. It's not just a construction of the human mind. It's not just a product of the human mind. There are various different understandings of the world, and some are more adequate to that world than other understandings are. So that's really, I think, mostly what's meant by this criterion of mind independence. So, in what sense could we talk about human artifacts, as being mind independent? Well, I mean, first in this sort of basic sense that they can physically survive the person who made them, right? Artifacts, they're in the archaeological sense. But I think we could also talk about them as being mind independent in the sense of granting certain kinds of affordances. Affordances, as you may know, is this philosophical term, which about, as it were, kind of the unintended consequences or capabilities that are created by something. And so this is certainly true of many human artifacts, right? I mean, they'd be created for a particular purpose, but they may be repurposed or prove useful for other kinds of purposes. So there's a sense in which as it were, the purpose of an object may be independent of the intentions of its fashioner. So those would be a couple of arguments I think you could make for the sense in which we could talk about human artifacts as being mind independent. And I mean, for me, really, the crucial point just is this one that it's kind of it's an answer to the neutron bomb thought experiment, which I've had some people throw at me and say, well, if you dropped a neutron bomb on a particular society, well, you would have that society would simply be completely gone because all social structures are completely dependent upon human activity. And what I'm trying to do is point up the limitations of that kind of a view, that there are a sense in which social structures are more than just what the interactionist ontology says they are, that is, human beings and their symbolic interactions with one another. I mean, it's of course also true that all kinds of symbolic relationships are often encoded in material artifacts. So, we can't really sort of draw the sort of clean distinction between symbols and things. I mean, that's very clear. And yet, a thing is not just a symbol. I mean, it can exceed in many ways the symbolic purposes for which it might have been created.
Okay, so on this question of, artifacts, and you really emphasize the importance of bringing back a material dimension into the study of social emergence, one of our listeners wants just basically to ask you to sort of elaborate more on methodological approaches that would help us recover this material dimension in the study of social emergence. Beyond Latour's actor network theory, we rarely see empirical analysis in American sociology that actually incorporate such analyses.
Yeah, so precisely because this is so understudied, I don't have myself a bunch of ready-made kind of methodological pointers to offer. I mean, I think all that I can really do is to just give you a couple of examples of what seem to be pretty successful efforts to reincorporate the material dimension into the social sciences. So one you've already pointed to, and that's the incorporation of actants, as it were, in actor network theory. So when you're talking, for example, about scientific practice, you don't just have the scientist and nature or whatever their natural object of study is. You include things like scientific papers and scientific instruments and laboratories and so on, and you look at the way in which knowledge, such as it is really the result of the interaction between all of these different actants, as opposed to simply being something that arises in the human mind and it, as it sort of passively observes nature. And I think the other area where this has been done really quite productively, interestingly, is in historical and political sociology. And here I could point to two examples. This is the work that Chandra Mukherjee of UC San Diego has been doing for a while, and then work which Farag Molnar has recently been doing on. And both of them, in Mukherjee's case, the work is on the state, in particular on the French state in the early modern and modern era. And she points out quite incisively that if we're talking about, for example, state as a kind of territorial association, the state as having territorial boundaries, the state as a power container, all these sort of familiar ways that political sociologists have of talking about the state. Those are not things which are accomplished in sort of purely symbolic or interactional terms, right? I mean, physical boundaries are created. Way stations and toll stations are created. Boundary markers are placed. Fences are put down. The military fortresses are set up. So the boundedness of a state is not just a quote-unquote cultural construct. I mean, it's also in many ways a physical construct that involves the creation and implantment of various kinds of physical artifacts. Interestingly, it may also just involve the reshaping of quote, nature itself, as she interestingly points out. And Farag Molnar has been doing work like this recently on Eastern and Central European nationalism. in her work on nationalist and ultranationalist movement, she's been paying a lot more attention to things like T-shirts and trinkets and banners and statues and so on and so forth. So, I think this is yet another way in which, we could think about what it would mean to incorporate a material or artifactual dimension back into the study of social movements. So instead of thinking about social movements just in terms of frames or sort of abstract material resources, we might want to think about them also in terms of the kinds of concrete objects which movements can and do deploy all the time as a way of performing or evoking certain kinds of loyalties or identities or whatever. So those would be examples, I think, of how people, some recent examples of how some social scientists have successfully reincorporated a material dimension into their work on particular social structures.
Well, so now a question that we have before us is kind of a larger meta-theoretical framing question. One listener wants to know how critical realism has influenced the way that you think about emergence and how you use it in your own work. You do bring this up more in your paper than you did in the talk, and I think critical realism was perhaps in the background of a lot of what you were saying today. And I'd like to tie that question about critical realism into a related question that somebody else is asking about how practices are related to this concept of emergence, right? There's a lot of, and I think that's a really important question because there's a lot of talk in social theory today about pragmatism and the practice turn. And in your talk, you're emphasizing so much material artifacts. So if you could tell us a little bit more about how critical realism specifically influences your understanding of emergence and where practices, pragmatism fits into this picture, that would be very helpful.
Well, I have to say that critical realism was incredibly important in the development of my thinking about emergence. In fact, it's the first place I really encountered the concept of emergence was first in Roy Boscar's work, and then later in Maggie Archer's work, and then after that in Dave Elder Vass's work. So I think an awful lot of the pioneering thinking about social emergence really was done by critical realists. And I mean, this is work which started appearing already in the late 70s, right? So very early on in the sort of broader reemergence of emergence in the philosophy of science and social science. And it was extremely attractive to me because it just seemed to solve so many problems all at once. I was sort of graduate school, early career. I mean, this was a period where rational choice was very much in the ascendancy within political science and was starting to make some inroads into sociology as well. And it certainly generated some insights, I think in particular around these questions of collective action and the free rider problem. But there was somebody who was doing kind of macro sociological historical work and didn't feel like I always needed to provide, micro foundations or micro translation for everything that I did, but I didn't really have a great argument about why I didn't think that was always necessary, and in fact why I sometimes thought that it was downright obfuscating and pernicious to demand that. And so the concept of emergence provided for me a kind of an escape from this sort of false choice between holism and social holism and methodological individualism, right? Insofar as it allowed one to think about various different levels, and it also allowed me to sort of understand for example, the power of Bourdieusian theory of social fields. What is a social field if not an emergent kind of social structure? So in all those ways, it was just very helpful. So let me say then a couple of things about how all of this relates to sort of the practice turn and neo-pragmatism. So first the practice turn. So I think it's, as you will have heard from the talk, I obviously think that the study of social practices or the turn to social practices was incredibly important and incredibly fruitful. That it's simply a fact by now pretty well established in cognitive psychology and other disciplines that an awful lot of what we do is in fact just kind of pre-reflective and scripted and habitual and routine and so on and so forth, and that not all action needs to be thought about in terms of some kind of conscious aiming at particular ends or some kind of explicit means-end schema or values or preferences or whatever. Right? I mean, I think that was incredibly productive. It could well be that the practice turn has turned a little bit too far and too hard. I think there's a danger that we sort of overstate the degree to which action really is pre-reflexive and unconscious. This is something that Margaret Archer has been pushing back against, and I think powerfully in some of her recent work. But it doesn't mean that we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think this all in all has been really, really important. So, what does the sort of emergence perspective that I've given here help us? How does this deepen our understanding of social practice? Well, again, I would sort of point to the role of materiality and artifactuality. I mean, if you think about a lot of the practices in your sort of daily life, your little unquestioned habits and routine, an awful lot of them are actually going to be anchored by physical artifacts, physical layout of the spaces that you inhabit. And conversely, probably a lot of the ones that you may not even be aware of are also going to be things that were inculcated in you by means of physical artifacts and physical layouts. So again, this example that I gave of the way in which architecture and home decoration is incredibly important in inculcating certain aesthetics, certain understandings of privacy, certain understandings of family and intimacy and so on and so forth, right? I mean, this is something that Bourdieu himself was attentive to in his early work. And if you look at the unread half of Outline of a Theory of Practice, where he describes the Kabila house and the Kabila household, there's a lot of attention to this. But if you look at the later work, Rules of Art, for example, this really recedes into the background. And I think that that's something that needs to be brought back into the foreground. So, key takeaway point here is just we need to tend more to the way in which artifactuality anchors and reproduces and inculcates various kinds of practice. So, last point about pragmatism. So, I personally draw a pretty sharp distinction between classical pragmatism, Dewey, James, Peirce, and neo-pragmatism, by which I mean Richard Rorty and his followers. So I think that Rorty has interpreted classical pragmatism in a somewhat misleading way, insofar as he argues that pragmatism is all about getting rid of metaphysics and paying no attention to ontology. So if you buy that reading of pragmatism, then you're going to think that pragmatism and critical realism are sort of arch enemies, right? But when I read the classical pragmatists, I don't read them that way at all. I could say a lot more about this, but I'll just say very briefly that one of the most important books that Dewey wrote late in his career was Experience in Nature, which is nothing if it's not a treatise on metaphysics. That's exactly what it is. And I'll simply add that his prize student Sidney Hook's dissertation was on the metaphysics of pragmatism. So the idea that pragmatism means that you don't care, you can stop caring about metaphysics, which I think is really is a huge misinterpretation, which is mostly owing to, Rorty's particular variant of neo-pragmatism. And I don't think that that pragmatism is at odds either with a certain kind of realism, with a certain kind of commonsensical realism. And here I would point especially to the work of William James, who, in a lot of his work, was really keen to emphasize the way in which our relationship to the world is mediated by physical activity, by physical interaction with the world. So this kind of skeptical, sort of epistemologically skepticist idea that, all of our relationship to the world is all sort of, obscured or, mediated by language and concepts and culture. That's, of course, true up to a point. But we don't know the world around us only in and through language, concepts, and culture. I mean, we also have direct contact with it. And this is a point that I think has been very effectively made in a recent book by Hubert Dreyfus and Charles Taylor, which is called Recuperating Realism, and draws a sharp distinction between what they call mediational theories and contact theories of our relationship with reality. And they are very much, they think mediation theories have gone too far, and they want us to sort of think more about the way in which we actually have contact with reality. This is true of our interactions with other people too, right? Which are partly mediated by symbols, but also have a kind of a direct contact element that escapes linguistic conceptualization to some degree.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, Phil, so I'm going to move to another question which I think critical realism can help clarify the way that your understanding of emergence has developed. There's been a series of questions asking you to expand or perhaps clarify your understanding, how this understanding of emergence is related to causation, right? So one reader asks, that your talk has focused mostly on emergence from the bottom up, from lower levels to higher levels. But could you say something about downward causation? And there's a couple of other questions about causal powers that have come in the different forms of emergence that you talked about and how they're related to causal powers. So, for example, one listener asked, don't epistemological forms of emergence actually yield some causal powers, even if sort of evanescently? And again, on this topic of causal powers, yet another listener was wondering if you could sort of draw out a little bit more of this threshold for ontological power within this taxonomy of different forms of emergence. And the listener's question is, well, isn't it partially true that the attribution of a causal power is dependent on the type of activity that you're interested in as a researcher? So he gives the example of a sand pile, which may not just be a case of epistemological emergence if we're at the beach and the sand pile features in our attempts to protect the sandcastle from the impending flood, right? So the power is specific to the activity that we're trying to accomplish, which is building a castle. So these are sort of three questions about your understanding of causal powers. One with regard to downward causation, because you talked mostly about upward. The other about sort of epistemological emergence and causal powers, and then sort of how do you delineate sort of this, how do you draw this line between ontological powers and epistemological or chaotic forms of emergence and the causal powers?
Okay, those are a lot of questions, Margarita. So you're going to have to sort of intervene and get me back on track if I forget to take one of them up. So first of all, let me take up the question of causal powers. So I completely agree with the idea that causal powers have to be understood relationally. I mean, we can't understand the powers of any structure, biological, physical, social, purely in isolation. Always understanding those powers, at least tacitly, as powers to do something in a particular context or to a particular other thing, right? And no question about that. So that's exactly right. Epistemological emergence as something that can have causal power. I mean, I think this is right in the sense that it can have some effect on human beings. The particular sort of whatever. I mean, if traffic jam forms, that's going to have some kind of an impact on our, not just on our sort of perception of things, so on our the route that we take to work or whatever, right? So that certainly is true that in certain circumstances, like a traffic jam, really can have causal effects. And whether or not we want to call those causal powers, I don't know. I'm not so sure about that question. Now, Marguerite, fourth questions.
Well, as it so happens, I don't entirely remember them either, but we are actually winding down. So rather than going back through my notes, I thought we could perhaps take the last 5 minutes to address some of the sort of the wrap-up questions, some of the bigger picture questions. As I mentioned earlier, we do, when you have submitted a question, if we haven't had a chance to get to it, we apologize for that. There's a lot of you on the call, but we do have a log with all of the specific questions in it. So if we didn't get to your question or you have a further question or clarification, we will be looking at all the questions and trying to answer them in some other form on our website. I've also realized now that we're nearly done with the call, only have a few minutes left, that I actually signed in somehow as Phil Gorski, but I just wanted to clarify that this is Margarita Mooney from Yale University. I'm actually not listed on the participant list because I chose Phil to host this meeting. So the person masquerading as Phil Gorski in the chat box has actually been yours truly, Margarita, which I didn't quite realize was happening until later on in the call. So I thought I would just take the last couple minutes here to say to feel free to submit more questions now or to follow up with questions with me and Phil. There have been a couple questions about whether or not what Phil has lectured on today is contained in his paper. I believe that he's gone beyond the paper that we sent out, and there's several other references to the lecture that he gave, which we will be posting on our website. Yes, the PowerPoint will be made available in some way or another. So we've got really, Phil, about just a couple of minutes left. So I thought I would actually just let you respond sort of overall to this question of, of all of the topics we could have started our Critical Realism webinar series with, you picked emergence, right? I know this is something you've been thinking about, something you've been working on a lot, and I wondered if you could just wrap up in a few minutes with sort of this larger picture question, just reminding us more why you think this concept of emergence is so important at this moment in social theory, and how it is, again, making that tie to critical realism as a way of kind of grounding, because you make this very clearly in your paper. People use the term emergence, but it's not just the term, but how we're using it and what we mean by it. Because the purpose of this webinar series is to introduce people or expand people's knowledge of a critical realist view of social science, and I think emergence is one key area that you've identified where there's really some need for theoretical clarification that has important practical, methodological, and ultimately explanatory implications.
Well, I think emergence is important for a whole bunch of reasons. I already mentioned that I think it's important for defending social science against reductionist campaigns from various quarters, which are ongoing and possibly even intensifying in recent years. So it's important to have a very clear account of why the social is never going to be reduced to the individual, is never going to be reduced to the neurological or whatever, and why there have to be different autonomous disciplines or sciences that study these different emergent levels of reality. I think another reason is that is kind of political or cultural, and that is that at least within the United States and possibly more broadly within the Anglophone democracies, there is a kind of individualistic understanding of human well-being, which I think is really too simplistic, and that one of the things which social science can and should do is to help us think more systematically about the kind of social conditions of individual well-being in a way that kind of goes beyond some sort of simple-minded, emotivism or utilitarianism, right? That human flourishing or well-being is something that can really only be fully achieved in and through social relations, social structures, and we need to think about broadly what those are. How critical realism sort of fits into all of this. I mean, again, at least for me, it's the area in which the thinking about these questions is longest and deepest so far. I mean, that's not to say that it's the only school of thought that's taken up these kinds of questions, but I think it's one that even people who wouldn't think of themselves as critical realists, would never think of themselves as critical realists, could learn from and and could profit from engaging with in a kind of a more systematic way. And there'll be more opportunities to engage with CR on our website and in upcoming webinars, the one by George Steinmetz in early December, and we're already in the process of lining up additional webinars for the spring. So in concluding, just let me thank all of you. This, as I'm sure you notice, is something that I'm continuing to think actively about, and the questions that came in were probing and extremely insightful and helpful for me. I'm going to now sit down and write down all kinds of notes for the next thing that I write about emergence. I learned a lot, and I hope that you also learned something too. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Phil. That was an excellent presentation. You will be receiving an email from us. Those of you who have listened in on this call, you'll be getting an email when we have posted the recording and other resources for you to continue learning about emergence. Thank you all for attending, and we do hope that this is just one step in a larger interactive process around this topic of critical realism, social theory, and human flourishing. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.